Okay. Today, I am very happy to have back with us. Gary South is back today. Not all of you know Gary, but he just flew in from his office. He runs his own firm, the Gary South Group, down in Santa Monica, and he's a campaign manager. So you're going to get to hear today from someone who's been running campaigns for years and really can tell you what it's like. He was recently named one of the top 50 most influential political players in California. He has advised and managed campaigns for president, U.S. Senate, governor, as well as lots of other offices, and he works in the private sector as well. In addition to running campaigns, he has worked within government at some points in his career, in both federal and state government, as a communications director, as well as chief of staff. He's flown in today just to talk to you. Please welcome Gary South.
Thank you, Alan. Can you all hear me? I'm going to keep my coat on, not because I'm stiff, but because I'm kind of cold today. I flew up from LA where it was like 74 degrees, and I get into SFO and it's like pouring down rain and, I don't know, 50 degrees. I was here, I think, Alan, 4 or 5 years ago, something like that. So thanks for the invitation to come back. Apparently you didn't get your fill that time, and it's a new crop of kids, right? So I want to start off today by just asking a couple of questions. First of all, how many of you are taking this class just because you have a general interest in politics? Whoa. How many are taking the class because they want to be involved in politics at some point, at some level? Volunteer, whatever. I see this. How many are taking the class because they actually want to run for office at some point? So we kind of winnowed the crowd out there, right? Well, I'm going to talk to you today about several things. But first, I want to just give you a little bit more about my background and how I got involved in this crazy business. My family's been involved in politics since the 1860s, not the 1960s, the 1860s, going back to my great-grandfather. My grandfather, my father, 2 of my brothers were all involved in politics at some level or another, and 4 of them in elective office. So, as you can tell, politics is kind of a genetic defect in my family. I come by it naturally. When I was in high school, I helped my dad in his city council campaigns in my little hometown in Montana, and then ran my brother's campaign for state legislature in Montana, and then it went on from there. Ran the Carter campaign in Montana, my home state. Now, on my mom's side, though, back 5 generations, they were involved in the circus business. I couldn't make this up. My great-great-grandfather, who's buried in LA, ran circuses around the New England states and up into the provinces of Canada. In fact, my grandfather, his great-grandson, was actually born on a circus train that was on a siding outside of Montreal, Canada. Now, is there anybody here who doesn't understand how these two things intersect with politics and circuses? There is a lot of showmanship in politics, sometimes more than we would want, more than we would hope. But it's a fun thing to do. I wouldn't have had my life turn out any other way. Met fascinating people, did some fascinating things, and it's the thing I like about politics and about campaigns is they are really ultimately very creative. You know, if you graduate from Berkeley and you go to Dow Chemical or someplace, you're going to a company that's been around for 50 years, 100 years. It's going to be around for another 50 to 100 years. Campaigns, though, all start from scratch. Even presidential campaigns, which are massive undertakings, and governor's races in California, which are massive undertakings, all start from scratch. You have to build the thing up. You have a candidate. You have an office that they're running for. You have to build the whole thing up from scratch. Hire the staff, rent the offices, develop the talking points, do the polling, do the focus groups, do the ads, and then ultimately, it's over on a given day. Unlike your income taxes, you can't file an extension if you're not quite ready by election day. It's over, and then it goes away. I've been doing this. My first campaign was in 1972, before I'm sure everyone in this room, probably even Alan, was born. I was 11. No, I was 21. And I've been doing it ever since. So 40 years of campaigns, 40 years of campaign management at the highest levels, including, as Alan said, president, senate, governor, lieutenant governor, mayor, city council, state legislature, county supervisor, and on down the line. I want to get into a little bit of California politics specifically here, because I want to put into context, you know, when you're watching news coverage, you're reading about campaigns that are happening here for the Senate, for governor, for president. You have to understand the scale of this state, the political scale. Now, we all know we're the biggest state in the union, right, with 38 million people. So that kind of speaks for itself. But I'm talking about political, the size of the state politically, the political dimensions of the state, which are so enormous that back in my home state, when I go back and lecture at my alma mater, University of Montana, and I lay out the scale of California and the scale of California politics, it is almost incomprehensible to the kids in my home state how big this state is. Here are some markers for you. We have more registered voters living in California, more registered voters living in California than there are people living in 46 of the other 49 states. So when you're running for governor of California, you're running for president in California, you're running for U.S. Senate in California, you have to appeal to 18 million voters. 18 million voters, that's what we have, give or take a few depending upon the election year. Los Angeles County, where I live, is the biggest county in the United States of America. 10 million people. By way of comparison, that's more people than live in 42 of the other 49 states, just in one county. And Los Angeles, of course, second biggest city in America, 4 million people. But we have only 40 state Senate districts in California. Back in my home state, we had 50. Each one of those Senate districts is bigger than my home state of Montana. So if you're running for the United States Senate in my home state of Montana, you are having to appeal to fewer voters than if you're running in one of the 40 state Senate districts here in California. And our state Senate seats here can be $8 to $10 million propositions running in a competitive state Senate seat in California. We have 53 members of Congress from California. There was only 435 in the whole Congress. We have 53 of them here. Last election, 2012, down in LA in the San Fernando Valley, there was one of our congressional races out of 53 where $11 million was spent getting elected to one of 53 seats. I ran Governor Davis's campaign for governor in 1998. In the primary, we had a candidate for governor named Al Checkey. Most of you probably don't remember this, but who was the owner of Northwest Airlines, which is based in Minneapolis. At the time, he was, according to Fortune magazine, the 113th richest man in America. He announced right off the bat he was not going to raise any money from anybody, he was going to spend only his own money. And he did, $40 million of it, which was, at that time, the most money that had ever been spent in any statewide campaign in the United States of America in history. $40 million. And by the way, he came in third. He got 12.5% of the vote for his $40 million. Fast forward to 2006, I'm running Controller Steve Wesley's campaign for governor in the Democratic primary. We actually outspent Checkey. We spent $43 million running in that primary and came in second to Phil Angelides. Fast forward another 4 years to 2010. Anybody ever hear of Meg Whitman? Meg Whitman, as astonishing as this is for even me to believe, spent $180 million running for governor of California and got beat by 13 points. An astonishing amount of money. So, two things I want to leave you with. One, when you talk about California politics, the scale is enormous. The scale is enormous. We have 11 discrete media markets inside of California. 11, all the way from Palm Springs up to Eureka. But there are 3 out-of-state markets that feed signal into California. So if you really want to cover the whole state, you not only have to buy all 11 markets in California, which include, by the way, the second most expensive market in America in LA, and the fourth most expensive market in the Bay Area here in terms of television costs. But you have to buy Medford, Oregon, and Reno, Nevada, and Yuma, Arizona. So when you put it all together, the size of California, the size of our districts, the size of our population, the size of our electorate is beyond anything people in most other states can even comprehend. And as a result of that, largely, the cost of our elections are enormous, enormous. Now, let me give you a little bit of a political primer on where we are right now in California. I moved here in 1991, so I've been involved in California politics for whatever that is, 23 years. And what has happened over 20 years, and by the way, I'm a Democrat, just so I don't, just in the interest of full disclosure. So what you're going to hear from me is coming from a Democrat, so you can have a Republican in later to try to rebut me. But the California Republican Party right now is in, if not a state of collapse, it's in a state of becoming essentially a minor party. Here are the statistics, and it's astonishing. The first year that the Secretary of State in California kept statistics on voter registration, on who was registering as a Democrat, who was registering as a Republican, was in 1922. Anybody care to guess what the Republican registration percentage was in 1922 in California? 63%. 63% of our electorate was registered Republican. Then we start a slow decline over the decades. 4 years ago, for the first time, they fell to 30%. That's the all-time historic low. That's less than a third of the electorate are registered Republicans. As of the latest Secretary of State statistics, which came in on the 31st of January, just a month, less than a month ago, they are now down to 28.73% of the electorate. 28.73%. And going down. Independent voters, those who don't register either as a Democrat, Republican, or Peace and Freedom, or Green, or whatever, we call no party preference, NPP, they're now up to 22%. It is only a matter of time, folks, before those lines intersect, and we will have more independent voters in California than we have registered Republicans. Now, how did this happen? As recently as 1995, the Republicans had the governorship, they had the Attorney General, they had the Secretary of State, they had the Insurance Commissioner. They had 24 members out of what was then a 52-member congressional delegation. They had 17 members of our 40-member state Senate, and they had 41 members in our 80-member state assembly. They actually took over our state assembly in the 1994 election. Now, fast forward to today. Here we are 20 years later. They have none of the eight statewide offices. They're completely shut out. Of our now 53 members of Congress, they have 15. They have 12 members of our 40-member state Senate, and they have 25 members of our 80-member state assembly. It has been really kind of a mind-boggling collapse, both in terms of voter registration and in terms of offices that are held by Republicans and where they can be competitive. Now, the major factor that has led to the Republicans' demise in California, or near demise, is something that we call minorities. The Republican Party in California has failed to comprehend what has happened to this state demographically over the last 20 years. And as a result, they're still acting as if we're in 1992 or 1994, and failing to take into account that unless they compete for and are competitive with minority voters, they simply cannot be viable in this state. More statistics. Between the 2000 census and the 2010 census, Latinos in California, and by the way, there are 58 counties in California, Latinos in California expanded their ranks between 40% and 100% in a 10-year period of time in 29 of the 58 counties, half of them. In another 16, they expanded between 30 and 40%, and in another 9, between 20 and 30%. There was only one county in California, Alpine County, which is up by Yosemite, which is, by the way, the smallest county in California, has about 1,100 people living in it. Did Latinos actually go down in terms of percentage? So you've all heard all of the hand-wringing from the National Republicans about the McCain campaign in 2008 and the Romney campaign in 2012, and how they got, respectively, 25% of the Latino vote nationally and 27% of the Latino vote nationally. And you've heard and probably read about the national Republican leaders, including the new chairman, talking about how we have to do outreach, we have to do outreach, we have to do outreach, we have to do outreach. We have to be able to compete for the Latino vote, or we're going to be dead in America because of the fast-growing Latino vote. And you know what? They're right. But I'm going to give you a dirty little secret. Latinos are only their third worst minority as of today. Among blacks, I know it's kind of funny. Among blacks, they get in a presidential election, they get between 5 and 9% of blacks nationally. Okay? In fact, there was a poll that was done in the summer of 2012. National poll, like 2,000 people in the poll, sample, where Mitt Romney was getting 0% of the black vote. Now, in my whole years in politics, I have never seen a poll at any level for any candidate in any race where they were getting 0% of anything. That is almost impossible, statistically. So I told you that Latinos had increased their ranks in California between 2000 and 2010 by 28%. But guess what? They're not even the fastest growing minority in California. You know who that is? That's Asians. Asians increased between 2000 and 2010 by 31% in California. In fact, if you look at the 2010 census, Latinos and Asians together are now an absolute majority of California, over 50%. That doesn't even include blacks, who are another 7%. So do the math. We are now, people who look like me, are a very distinct minority in California, and in fact, it's even gotten worse since 2010, because last year, the lines, in 2010, in the census, 40% of California was Caucasians, people like me, and 38% were Latino. Those lines crossed in 2012, and it was 39-39. As of this year, there are more Latinos in California than there are Caucasians, for the first time ever, since we belong to Mexico. So they have serious, serious problems with Latinos. But again, the dirty little secret is, in 2012, they were also exposed as having even worse problems with Asian Americans. Another statistic that's mind-boggling. In California, for example, in 1992, Bill Clinton versus George Herbert Walker Bush, here was the Asian American vote, 39% for Clinton and 39% for Bush. It was a tie in California. Bush actually won more of the Asian vote nationally than Clinton, but in California it was 50-50. 4 years later, Asian American vote, California. Clinton, 53%, Dole, 40%. 4 years later, Gore versus Bush. Asian Americans, 60% for Gore, 33% for Bush. George W. Bush, the not too smart Bush. 2008, Obama versus McCain. Obama, 64% of the Asian vote. McCain, only 35% of the vote. Now we get to 2012. Obama, 79% of the Asian vote in California, and Romney, 21%. I mean, if a Republican cannot look at this and understand that they have problems with minorities beyond Latinos, then there's no way that you can really describe to them the deep, blank, blank, blank that they're in. In 2012, for the first time ever in American history, nationally, Asians voted for the Democrat for president in a higher percentage than Latinos. Latinos were 71% for Obama, and Asians were 73% for Obama nationally. And I've given you the California figures. This is also the first time in California history that Asians have ever voted for a Democrat for president in a higher percentage than Latinos. And if you go back 20 years to 1994, it's now 2014, and you look at every Republican candidate for president in California and every candidate for governor, Republican governor candidate in California, the average percentage across 20 years that they have received of the Latino vote is 25%, 1/4 of now the largest ethnic group in California. And among Asians, only 37%. On average, every presidential and gubernatorial candidate on the Republican ticket in California. And it's interesting because, when I talk to my Republican friends, they all say, well, Latinos and Asians are voting Democratic now because they're a younger demographic. Latinos are actually the youngest demographic in the United States in terms of age. But, as these people go to college and marry and have families and start their own business and buy their own house, they're going to get more naturally conservative because that's what happens to people. In fact, Ronald Reagan in the 1980s made a famous comment, which turned out to be somewhat less than prophetic. He said, Hispanics are Republicans who just don't know it yet. Well, guess what? Here we are, 2014, and they're so thick they still don't know it. Because if you look at research being done among second-generation Latinos and Asians, both in California and nationally, and Pew, which is a very reputable polling organization, nonpartisan, has done a lot of this. Second-generation Latino and Asian immigrants are actually more democratic and more liberal than their parents. So it's getting worse for them, not better, not better. And one thing we know from a lot of research over decades is that when you register to vote at 18 and you start your voting patterns until you're 29, 30, 34, it's not always the case, but those early voting patterns tend to be very predictive of your behavior later in life. Now, there are some people who do become more conservative as they age, but there are some people who become more liberal when they age. Example being this. Take California and gay marriage. All of you remember in 2008 when Prop 8 was on the ballot, which banned same-sex marriage? It passed. It passed. And it passed largely because older voters, over 65, more conservative, true, and ethnic voters, meaning primarily blacks and Latinos, voted for Prop 8, voted against same-sex marriage. Now, here we are only 6 years later. This is not 20 years, not 10 years, 6 years later. If Prop 8 was on the ballot today in California, it would go down in flames. How do we know that? Because of the polling that's been done. A majority of Californians now support same-sex marriage, even though some of them voted against it in just 2008. And partly it is because among younger ethnic voters, Latino and Asian, they have become much more liberal on social issues than their parents. I mean, I have nieces and nephews who are teens, and to them, probably to most of you, it's like, what's the argument about same-sex marriage? I mean, why wouldn't we do that? I don't get it. What are they arguing about? What is everybody so up in arms about? It's just unfathomable to younger voters that we could be arguing about same-sex marriage, legalization of marijuana, all the other things that end up being the passel of social issues that Republicans have gotten afoul of the voters on, not only in California, but also across the country. I was talking to Alan before I came up here. You know, I had an opportunity in March. The new chairman of the state Republican Party, former Senator Jim Brulte, who's a friend of mine, invited me as a Democrat to come to the board of directors of the California Republican Party and tell them how full of shit they were. And I thought about it, and I thought, you know, this is kind of fun. It's Daniel in the Lion's Den. But so I did a 39-page PowerPoint with a lot of the statistics that I've just outlined to you. By the way, not a single person in the room was aware that in 1922, Republicans had 63% of the electorate in California. It was like, and you know, the point I made to them was I said, look, a party is to some degree like a retailer. And if a retailer doesn't keep up with the market, they go out of business. Have you seen any open Blockbuster stores lately around? By the way, how's your Blackberries doing? When a retailer doesn't keep up with the market and the market demand and doesn't keep up with the demographics, they go out of business. Same thing can happen to a political party. And I said, you know, if you're going to be a political party in California, you have to adapt to the electorate here. You don't have to give in on everything, but if you're a party that's anti-choice, anti-gay marriage, anti-marijuana, pro-offshore drilling, pro-gun, pro-tobacco, and you're trying to be competitive in California, I mean, maybe if you were the Wyoming Republican Party, you could get away with that. Maybe if you were the Oklahoma or Mississippi political party, you could get away with that. But when you're trying to compete in a state, no matter what state it is, you have to be pliable and you have to be able to adjust and adapt to that state. And I told them a great story from my home state of Montana. You know, Montana is a state about the size of California, a little bit smaller, but has 900,000 people. I mean, it'd be like taking California and throwing 37 million people out the door and have 900,000 people remaining. It's a big hunting and fishing state. My dad hunted, my brothers hunted, my cousins hunted, my uncles hunted. I never did, but and the whole issue of gun control is not debatable there. Whether you like it, don't like it, it's not debatable, right? And I've known every United States senator from Montana back to the time I was a teenager on the Democratic side. My guess is if they had been representing New York or New Jersey, they would have been avidly pro-gun control. But they had to give it up because if you're a Democrat in Montana and you come out for any form of gun control, you're dead as a doornail. So they have to bite their tongue and get the 100% NRA rating and vote against every gun control bill because that's the loss leader, if you will, to use another retail term, that allows them to do other things on the liberal side that they wouldn't be able to do if they weren't there. And I told them, I said, you know, you're going to have to figure out in California what it is you're going to give up. Because if you continue to be a hardline social issue party, you cannot be competitive here. You're not going to compete. You're going to die. They sat there respectfully and politely, and you know, I don't know if they got it. Alan asked me if they got it. I don't know if they got it or not. We'll see. But they cannot, and no party can, compete in a state if your view of the voters is that they're wrong and you're right. The least effective message in my 40 years of campaign politics that any candidate could ever use is to tell the voters that they're full of shit. It just doesn't work, folks. You have to be able to understand where the voters are on issues and adapt to that and accommodate that, or you have no viability in politics. Just a little bit about campaigning. You know, it's one of the things that you know when you've had as many candidates as I've had that you've handled is that candidates are human. Might come as a shock to some of you, but They're human, and they are capable of doing great things and doing things very well, and they're capable of being complete idiots. I had a candidate I was running for county executive in a county in Maryland right outside of Washington, D.C., and he was a college professor actually at the University of Maryland. And he kind of came off like a college, kind of an egghead and talked in very professorial and pedantic terms. And so one night we decided we were going to try to loosen him up a little bit and take him out to sports bars around these blue-collar areas of Prince George's County. And so we went into this one where there's a guy, with a tattoo on the back of his neck sitting at the bar watching basketball on TV. And my candidate went up to him and, patted him on the back and said, "So, what do you think of that NAACP tournament?" You get it? NAACP is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. It's not the National Collegiate Athletic Association. I had a candidate once who actually kept referring to somebody else's Rolodex watch. I had one who said the answer to the traffic problems was more HIV lanes on the freeways. One who one time referred to Paul's epistle to the Philippians as Paul's epistle to the Filipinos. It's sort of like, I'm sure you all know what Tourette syndrome is. I mean, I don't mean to minimize it, but every candidate has a Tourette syndrome type thing going on in their head where the most ridiculous things can come out of their mouth at the most inopportune times. And all of us who've done campaigns have had to deal with that. And, even very smart candidates like Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, and you followed them, are capable in their weak moments of saying things that are completely off the wall. I have a 7-year-old child, boy, and when I take on a candidate, I kind of model that candidate as my 7-year-old child in a way. And I don't mean to diminish candidates, but politics is a hard profession. It's a hard profession even for us operatives. In fact, I've spent 40 years of my life out there trying to sell candidates to voters. In my next life, I've resolved I'm going to try to sell something people really want to buy, like beer or, I don't know, tickets to concerts that are hard to get into. But being in politics is tough because, particularly now with social media, I tell candidates, look, folks, this is not a cell phone. This is a recording device and a camera, okay? And if you don't get that, you're going to get yourself in trouble. Anything you say, and remember Romney's famous 47% remark from the 2012 campaign? That was recorded on a cell phone, set on a bar. Remember Barack Obama from 2008 when he made the comment in what he thought was a closed fundraising event in Seattle about how bitter people cling to God and guns? Turns out somebody was there recording the whole thing. There is no privacy anymore. In fact, I told one male candidate, look, if you go into the urinal and you're over here and the guy beside you has one hand free and is on his cell phone, don't assume he's on his cell phone. This is a camera. He could be recording you. So, particularly with the explosion of social media, there never has been a lot of privacy in politics, but particularly now, there is none. And candidates have to be aware that anything they say in any context, even in a closed meeting, in a car, no matter where it is, could literally be on the front page of the newspaper the next day or be on YouTube where it gets 2 million hits. So even though they're not perfect, I admire people who take it upon themselves to run for public office. I'm glad somebody does it. Again, I had relatives who did it. My dad was on city council in my hometown, no pay. Getting calls at 2 o'clock in the morning from people complaining about things. But it's an honorable profession, and we should all feel lucky and feel grateful that there are people who are willing to take on what is a very invasive career, where you have no privacy. Everything about your dirty laundry is aired out in public. And, luckily we have people who are willing to take government jobs. Otherwise, we wouldn't be a democracy. So, are we ready for Q&A? Yeah. So thank you, and that's a little bit of a smattering of things. Any questions out there? By the way, I remember when I was here before, I got heckled by an Asian kid, a Republican, like out sitting in the middle there.
Maybe he's back.
I don't know, but if he is, he's pretty lonely now, given the statistics I just gave you, don't you think? Yeah. It's changed. Oh, the question was, thank you for giving such a brilliant, the question was, how do I think campaigns have changed with the introduction of social media and all the data production? They've changed immensely. And in fact, I have to tell a story on myself. I couldn't make this up because it's embarrassing even though it's true, okay? In 1994, I was doing then State Controller Gray Davis's campaign for Lieutenant Governor. And I had a young assistant in my office who was probably 22 who, I was not computer literate, by the way. And by the way, we had computers that had DOS, Direct Operating System, if you know what that means. I saw him for a couple of days like furiously typing this memo to me. And I said, what are you doing, David? And he said, I'm typing you a memo. So he comes in and gives it to me. And the whole thrust of the memo is that we need to have a website. And I swear to God, I said, David, I really appreciate the work you put into this, but no self-respecting voter is going to get on the internet to find out information about a candidate. I was wrong. But in my defense, the first presidential campaign ever to have a website was Bill Clinton in 1992. The first gubernatorial candidate in California ever to have a website was Kathleen Brown that very year in 1994. That's how fast things have changed. And it used to be that in order to get information out, what we call free media, in other words, not stuff you're paying to put on the air, you had to go to newspapers, basically. TV stations essentially don't cover politics. They don't think it's good business. So you had to go to a newspaper and plant something with a reporter. The reporter had to write the story, had to go through the editors, sometimes through the editorial board, before it ever saw print. Now, you can literally have something on a social, media site that has hundreds of thousands of hits in just a few minutes. In fact, I was just reading a book on the way up here about the 2012 presidential campaign. During the debates between Obama and Romney, on the second debate, there were 2 million tweets sent about that debate during the debate. So things have gotten lightning fast, lightning fast. And there's good aspects to it, there's bad aspects to it. A lot of misinformation on the internet, if you haven't noticed. But it is a reality, and every campaign has to deal with it. It's never going to go back to the way it was. What do I see coming like 20 years from now when you all are running for office? Right. Well, you'll be happy to know that California now has a law that prohibits revenge porn. I'm not speaking to you specifically, but look, the fact is, with political advertising in specific, every single cycle, every 2 years, there's fewer and fewer people who are being accessed by buying these expensive television ads. In fact, when I've done focus groups, sometimes 5 or 8 days out from an election where tens of millions of dollars have been spent, there are 2 or 3 people in every focus group who say, I haven't seen any ads yet for any of the candidates because of TiVo, because of DVRs, because a lot of people are getting news now basically sent to them through an app in their phone, their smartphone, rather than watching TV. I barely watch TV. I just almost never, I have cable. I barely watch TV. So the conveyor belts in politics and campaigns with which you are conveying information to people have already changed dramatically in 20 years and are going to change just as dramatically in the next 20 years. I do think that any campaign, though, that simply relies on social media at this stage is probably making a mistake. It is very important, but it's not the totality of how you communicate with voters. And let's face it, if you're a 67-year-old voter somewhere, you're probably not hanging on Twitter. So you have to, it's basically expanded the ways that you have to communicate to voters, but it's also made campaigns more expensive. Because you can't just do one thing. You can't just do two things. You have to do everything, and you have to do it relatively well with social media. Tell my friend Jim Brulte hello. I'll go back to what I said before and just restate it a little bit. When I was running Governor Davis's campaign for governor in 1998 against Dan Lundgren, who was a Republican Attorney General, very conservative, much more conservative than Pete Wilson. National political reporters would come back here, like Fred Barnes from the New Republic and Dan Balls from the Post, and they would interview Lundgren and say, well, wait a minute, you're anti-choice, you're anti-gun control, you're pro-offshore drilling, you're anti-environment. How do you fit? How do you do this? How do you become governor of California? And he would like wag his finger and say, oh, you don't understand. Californians are more conservative than they even know, okay? The basic problem Republicans here have, in my humble opinion as a Democrat, is they have this fantasy in their head that somehow there is a silent conservative majority out there in California. That if you just put up the right candidate and say the right thing, they'll come around. There is no silent conservative majority in California. And you know, Republicans are still looking at Reagan Democrats as sort of the holy grail. We got to get those Reagan Democrats back. That's why Reagan won these big, massive landslide victories. Well, they're true. That's right. But do the math, okay? It's 1980. Ronald Reagan is running against Jimmy Carter, who I work for. Let's say you're a 54-year-old auto mechanic in the Inland Empire who's a registered Democrat, but you kind of had it because, you know, all these minorities and people on welfare and the whole thing. So you don't change your registration, but you voted for Ronald Reagan. That's what they're talking about in terms of Reagan Democrats. But again, do the math. If this guy was 54 years old in 1980, it's 2014. Can you tell me how old he would be today? He's dead. There are no more Reagan Democrats. Reagan is dead. I mean, you can't keep chasing a holy grail that like a mirage just keeps moving further and further and further down the horizon. And as I said, they either have to adapt on some basis or they will die. And by the way, don't think that parties can't die. If you go to the South, where Democrats used to have solid control, there are states in the South where there is no functioning Democratic Party. Texas has 22 statewide elected office holders. Not a single one is Democrat. So parties can die, and the Democrats have done it in the South in some of the deep South states. It can happen to the Republicans here too. With that, I will just say good luck. Well, that's really the situation that we're in today. I mean, this is not a specter we have to look forward to. I mean, Democrats are simply not competitive in a lot of the South, in the states in the South. Democrats are not going to carry anything in Mississippi or Oklahoma or Texas or Louisiana. So the polarization, which I'm sure you've been talking about in that class, the partisan polarization in the last 10 years in America has been immense. It's not healthy, I concede, but it's a fact. And part of the reason in the Congress, by the way, and here's another little hit on Republicans, They cleaned up in 2010, electing a whole bunch of governors, taking over a whole lot of legislative chambers, and they had effective control of redistricting in lots of states, including some states that vote Democratic nationally. They gerrymandered the seats with our modern day technology in such a way that they have literally solidified their control of the House, probably until the next census. Okay, we're not going to take the House back anytime in this decade. But they won the battle and they'll lose the war, because you know what? Of the 217 seats that Republicans have in the Congress of the United States of America, 25 of those seats have a Latino vote of 25% or more. You wonder why immigration reform isn't being done? Because when these people go back to these lily white districts that have been carved out for them, they don't have any imperative to do immigration reform. In fact, their constituents are opposed to it. And the biggest danger that Republicans have in the Senate and in the House nationally is not being defeated by a Democrat in the fall. It is being defeated by somebody further to the right in their party primary. That's what they're all petrified about. I mean, Mitch McConnell, the minority leader of the Senate, has a right-wing challenger. John Cornyn, the second leader, Republican leader in the Senate, has a right-wing Republican opponent. So these fights are being carried out in party primaries now, not so much in the general election. And that is really bad in a way for both parties. To have the most leftist element in the Democratic Party, the most right element in the Republican Party, determining who goes and sits in the Congress of the United States. It's not healthy.
It's 5 o'clock now, so thank you.
Oh, thank you.